Thanks. Well, just before I move on to the substantial point that I was going to make, I have to say that we're absolutely shocked to hear that Fianna Fail aren't going to support this bill. Knowing that the government aren't opposing it, you would have thought that they would at the very least allow this bill progress to the next stage and to amend it if they want to. And effectively, the excuses that they've made are absolutely pathetic. Apparently, it's revolutionary to name in a bill areas, and it says the word areas, that can be included in a curriculum. Apparently that's just, unbelievable, and for that reason they can't support it. We all know the real reason why you're not supporting it. It is to do with you do not want to challenge the religious ethos of the schools, and that would be a much more honest way of you to say so. I just ask you to think, if Fianna Fail don't support this tomorrow, where you're placing yourself on the spectrum, in a European context, to oppose objective sex education is to be utterly backward and reactionary. And the Oireachtas Committee, which your own party members took part in, recommended this very thing. It recommended these areas be explored in the curriculum, and it also recommended that it had to be independent of school ethos. Our bill is exactly in line with what the Citizens' Assembly and the Oireachtas Committee recommended. And I really would ask the members of Fianna Fail to consider that if they block this bill and allow it to fall, how they're going to be viewed. This bill is supported by, at the press conference to launch the bill, we had in attendance the Rape Crisis Network of Ireland, the Irish Family Planning Association, the National Women's Council of Ireland, student unions, Shout Out. We had a whole myriad of groups that have backed and asked for this bill to be backed, and that's reflected in the fact that the government have said they're not going to vote it down. And to say that there's a review on the way, let's put this in context. Asking members of the NCCA, wonderful as many of them may be, to do a review of the curriculum means very little, because unless you actually challenge the legal right in the Education Acts of 1998 of schools to use religious ethos as a way to censor or not provide sex education, there's no guarantee the wonderful curriculum that you draft will actually be taught. And the reason I know it is I taught sex education in schools, and I know exactly what happens. What happens is a teacher arrives in September, is handed a timetable with their geography, their history, their maths or whatever else, and plonked in there is this thing called RSE, SPHE, etc. No training, no assessment of whether the teacher will be personality-wise anyway inclined to teach that subject. And if you got a day's in-service, you were doing well. And we all know that teachers have their own prejudices. And notwithstanding what was said by Deputy O'Sullivan, I very much doubt in most schools that there's a curriculum being taught which is affirmative of LGBT plus students. There is not. We know that because lots of students have written into us. The type of sexuality that is taught in schools tends to be between a man and a woman, and it tends to be about procreation and reproduction. There are other types of sex that actually take place in society, but students are not being taught about them, and also I think the key focus that I was going to talk about was the issue of consent. This has become, a #1 central issue in Irish society. It was brought out in particular in relation to the recent rape trials and also highly publicised events, such as in one school, where girls' names were actually being written on the walls of toilets by schoolboys who then rated them as whether or not they should be raped. We have a problem. As Professor Ging from GCU said, a cultural shift in thinking about sexism, sexual abuse and harassment is needed, and this includes our schools. Along with reviewing and updating curricula, we need to focus on changing practices in schools that may reinforce harmful gender stereotypes and limit development for both boys and girls. Teaching young people about sex shouldn't be viewed as a set of problems to be managed, but as an opportunity to empower them as sexual citizens. And I have to say that that massive culture shift can't be done alone through a sex ed programme, but obviously the first place you would start is among young people when they're all gathered in schools. And if you needed confirmation, you only have to look at toxic masculinity personified in the WhatsApp messages that were reported in the media, where men and boys are encouraged to be dominant, to be physical, to disregard the needs of women. Women are there for their entitlement, for their pleasure. We saw that graphically in those messages. Why is it that a defence can be put up in any trial that somebody didn't say that someone didn't say yes, but they didn't say no? And that is not a defence in any crime of any other type except sexual assault or rape. We have to completely challenge these dangerous ideas. And we know that something is seriously wrong, not because of government research, because the Savvy report has been mentioned. It's outrageous that we haven't got proper research done. But the Sexual Health and Attitudes Galway study that was done last year is very instructive, and it was done among 1,691 students in that university. 35% of males thought it was okay for a guy to get carried away and end up forcing a woman to take part in non-consensual sex. That's over 1 in 3 boys or young men. And 37% thought it was the way a woman dressed could justify her getting into trouble. These are horrific attitudes. They have to be tackled. And I'm sorry about the niceties that Fianna Fail thinks should go into a bill. If you don't think there's a serious problem, well then there's something wrong with your party. Now, the SMART workshop on consent, for example, that was done in Galway, actually had an important change in attitudes. The numbers of people, after taking part in this very short workshop, who felt informed, they understood what consent meant and felt more comfortable, rose from 23% to 65%. And, Minister, that's a non-government funded workshop. We have to say this is not acceptable, that students and others are having to raise the funds to do these things for themselves. These things should be funded by the state and should be taking place in schools and colleges. And the idea of seeking an enthusiastic yes from somebody rather than a no, this is a concept that we have to popularise. It's very difficult to bring this about unless we encourage students to actually challenge established ideas that are promoted, unfortunately, by some religions. The idea that the girl is a gatekeeper of sexuality is a very strong concept running through. Again, Dr. Ging's analysis in the Irish Times found that loads of boys' schools don't get any sex ed at all. There's a lower compliance rate in boys' schools. And the girl is obviously meant to manage and gatekeep that girls and women should be entitled to a positive sexuality themselves. They should be entitled to be taught that they can have pleasure from sex and that they don't have to be a passive recipient or activist or shamed for taking part or wanting to take part in a sexual act. A very simple message we could be teaching young people is this, that relationships and sexual activity should make you feel good, and if they don't, there's something wrong. It's a very simple but a very revolutionary idea, because unless we put the idea of a positive sexuality, of pleasure being part of that, pleasure as a measure of their consent and as an element of sexual activity, well then young people won't be able to decipher their own comfort levels when something takes place. And I do think we have to be clear, it's not the internet that's caused all of this. Obviously the internet makes things a lot more complicated, but there was problems and attitudes before the internet ever came along. Men didn't go looking for consent before the internet. It didn't suddenly all start then. And I think, so it isn't just about tackling the internet, it's about tackling cultural attitudes that go back a long, long time. And I think only reproductive and gender normative intercourse being taught is not going to tackle that. And that is the religious ethos of a lot of schools. None of this can happen, actually, if religious ethos holds sway. So I would again appeal to all the parties in the Dáil not to block this bill from progressing at least to the next stage. It's been supported and backed by a whole host of organisations who won't be pleased that it's just been blocked for very spurious reasons.